What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my week one quarterback start sits. If you guys are new to the channel, the way I do my start sits is I'm going to break down every single week one matchup, so all 16 games, talk about all 32 starting quarterbacks, and then I'm going to list them as either a start, a fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the quarterbacks you feel very confident throwing into your lineup. So typically like your mid to high end QB1s. So either like your just elite stud quarterback options that you're starting every single week, or maybe some of those mid to back end QB1s, high end QB2s who could have some favorable matchups that would make them really strong starts. The fringe options are going to be more of like your back end QB1s, high end QB2s. I do think this year there's going to be a decent amount of fringe options every week just because there's so much depth at the quarterback position. And then sits are going to be quarterbacks that you would prefer to keep on your bench. If you guys missed it, I've already put out my running back and wide receiver start sit videos. So check those out after this one if you guys are interested. If you have any fantasy questions, you can drop them down below. But let's dive right into the Thursday night matchup where we have the Ravens taking on the Chiefs. And let's not overcomplicate this. Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, two of the top four drafted quarterbacks this year, both high upside guys. They're both going up against solid defenses. Ravens defense is solid. Chiefs defense is solid. But when you draft a guy like Lamar Jackson, you draft a guy like Patrick Mahomes, those are going to be dudes who are starting in your lineup every single week. So both those dudes are going to be pretty clear starts for me. Then shifting over to the Friday night matchup, we have the Packers taking on the Eagles. And honestly, for Jordan Love here, I did go back and forth between a start and a fringe option. And if this was the same Eagles defense we saw last year, where they were just getting torn up every week, the secondary was in shambles, they were giving up, a high number of points to the quarterback position and wide receivers last year. If this was the exact same unit, the exact same situation, Jordan Love would be listed as a start for me. I do think the Eagles upgraded. I think their defense is going to be better this year. Jordan Love, right, is more in like that back-end QB1 territory for me. So I have him as a fringe option, but I assume if you draft him as your quarterback one, he's going to be your starter this week. And then for the Eagles, Jalen Hurts is in that tier I just talked about with Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes. I have him as my quarterback too. He is going to be a start as long as he is healthy, no matter the matchup. Now shifting over to the Sunday slate, we have the Steelers taking on the Falcons. No surprise here, Russell Wilson, obviously going to be a sit. I don't know how long he's going to hold on to this job for. When he is the starter, I don't think he's going to be super fantasy relevant. Just not a great offensive situation. So Russ, definitely going to be a sit. For the Falcons, I think it'll be fun to see Kirk Cousins back out there. We'll see how he looks, first game back from the torn Achilles. Not a terrible matchup, not a great matchup here against the Steelers. I want to see it first. He needs to obviously give you great passing production because he's not going to give you much on the ground. So I think he's a fringe option. He's a decent QB2. If you waited in the draft, punted the quarterback position, he's fine to throw into your lineup, but I don't think, you're starting Kirk Cousins and feeling amazing about it. In the next matchup here, we're going to have the Cardinals taking on the Bills. These are two quarterbacks that I really like. Kyler Murray is my favorite quarterback target this year. I think he's being undervalued. I actually have him ranked ahead of a guy like CJ Stroud. So I'm very high on Kyler. The best weapons of his career with Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride. He has that rushing upside. So I think Kyler's a really strong start. And then Josh Allen, my quarterback one, seems to be the consensus QB1. He is obviously going to be locked into your lineup every single week. Pivoting over to the Titans-Bears matchup. For the Titans, I think Will Levis is interesting this season. I think he could become fantasy relevant. They've definitely tried to build around him. This Bears defense is solid. Week one, if you're having to rely on Will Levis in like a one quarterback league, your quarterback position's probably in shambles. He's definitely going to be a sit, but someone who could have some potential later on in the season. And then I did go back and forth here with Caleb Williams because I know there's going to be some uncertainty, starting a rookie quarterback, having, him ranked as a start here in week one. But I think he's going to come out of the gate and produce at a very high level. We know he has the weapons. DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, Keenan Allen. You have DeAndre Swift out of the backfield. Cole Kmet at the tight end position. I also think this is a pretty solid matchup here. The Bears are expected by Vegas to put up points. They have the 8th highest implied point total. So I'm going to go with Caleb Williams here as a start. I think he's going to get it done as a passer. He also has some rushing upside. So Caleb's a start. Will Levis is going to be a sit. In the next game, we have the Patriots taking on the Bengals. And for the Patriots here, not shocking that Jacoby Brissett is going to be a sit. it feels like it's only a matter of time before Drake May takes over. And I do think Drake May could have some fantasy upside, but with Jacoby at the quarterback position, he's definitely going to be a sit for me. And then for the Bengals, I have Joe Burrow as a start. And I will just say that this Jamar Chase situation is still up in the air. If Jamar Chase is not playing week one, which I think he's going to play week one, I think they're going to figure something out. But if Jamar Chase is not playing week one, I would probably bump Joe Burrow down more to like a fringe option in like that Jordan Love area, because he's still obviously a great quarterback. He has a decent amount of rushing upside, kind of in like that Mahomes area. But without his top weapon, I think he's more of like a back-end QB1. If Jamar Chase is playing, he's a solid start, a mid-tier QB1 play. Moving over to a divisional matchup between the Texans and the Colts. For the Texans here, I think CJ Stroud is a solid start. I don't know if he has as much upside as some people are thinking, but I do think he has the, opportunity to just go nuclear this season as a passer. 5,000 plus yards. I think we could be looking at 30, 35, maybe 40 passing touchdowns out of CJ Stroud. The weapons are stacked. He looked great as a rookie. Throwing to Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Stephon Diggs, Dalton Schultz. I think CJ Stroud's going to have a great year. I like him as a nice mid-tier QB1. And then for the Colts, I know we didn't see a ton out of Anthony Richardson last year, but I saw enough to know that this dude is going to be a great fantasy quarterback. He's going to have the rushing upside. I think he'll be good enough as a passer. I like him as a very solid start here. He is my quarterback 5 this season. So, barring him really struggling right out of the gate, I think he's someone you can put in your lineup every single week, regardless of matchup. Now, in this next game here, we have the Jaguars taking on the Dolphins. And I think both these guys are like the definition of fringe quarterbacks, at least heading into the season here. They're both guys that are probably being drafted outside the top 12. Maybe you punted the position, you snagged like Trevor Lawrence, Tua, maybe you have a quarterback 2. Maybe you don't. I think if you waited at the quarterback position, they're fine options to go in your lineup. They're more in like that fringe QB1 territory. I am pretty high on Trevor Lawrence this year. Out of those later round quarterback options, he's definitely one of my favorite ones. So I think he's going to, take a step forward, but definitely want to see it a little bit. Definitely more of that like fringe QB1 territory. And then for Tua, I'm not as high on Tua as consensus. I think he's going to rack up a lot of passing volume, but he just gives you so little on the ground that he has to just dominate through the air to have any sort of fantasy upside. I mean, like the dude led the NFL in passing yards last year, and he still finished outside the top 12 quarterbacks in points per game. So I think he's fine as like a high-end QB2 play, but definitely not all in on Tua in this matchup, or throughout the season. Now we have a divisional matchup between the Panthers and the Saints, and this is one that I think pretty much everyone can agree we should be staying away from. Sitting Bryce Young, sitting Derek Carr. I do think the Panthers are going to be better this year. I like them bringing in Dave Canales to be their head coach, but it would have to be a pretty extreme jump from Bryce Young to go from what we saw last year to him all of a sudden being a super fantasy relevant option. So both these dudes are going to be sits. In this next matchup, we have 2 more sits. It's the Vikings taking on the Giants. For Sam Darnold, I do think he's someone who could become relevant for fantasy, especially when we have some injuries, when we're getting into bye weeks. I do think he could be playable, but week 1, I would hope you have some better options, on your roster. And then for the Giants, Daniel Jones, I feel like at this point we kind of know, he should definitely be a sit. We're going to have the Raiders taking on the Chargers. Gardner Minshew won the Raiders quarterback battle. Even though he won the job, definitely not someone I want to be playing for fantasy. For the Chargers, I really like Justin Herbert. I talked about how I like Trevor Lawrence as like one of those later round options. It was Trevor Lawrence and Justin Herbert. Those were kind of like my guys if I missed out on like the early to mid round options. So I think he's a nice fringe play. I know the weapons aren't great. I just think he's too talented of a quarterback to not be fantasy relevant this year. So he is going to be a fringe option. Then moving over to the Broncos Seahawks game. For the Broncos, I wouldn't be shocked if Bo Nix became somewhat relevant, especially once we're getting into bye weeks. But week 1, definitely want to see it a little bit out of both Bo Nix as a rookie and then this Broncos offense as a whole. And then for the Steelers, I think Geno's kind of in the same boat. Kind of regressed negatively last year after a pretty solid 2022. I do think the Seahawks offense is interesting. They have a lot of solid weapons, but week 1, I am going to be listing Geno as a sit. We're going to have the Cowboys taking on the Browns. Some people may not agree with this. I have Dak as a fringe option. I feel like he's in that same range with guys like Joe Burrow, Jordan Love. I talked about how I have Jordan Love as a fringe option. And I have the same with Dak, and it's really just due to the matchup here. This is a tough game against this Browns defense, probably a top 5 defense in the NFL. So even though he's solid, I don't think he's in that tier, with like Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, where he's just an auto start. I think he's a fringe option. If you drafted him, you're probably playing him, which is fine, but it's definitely not an ideal matchup for him or the Cowboys offense. And then for the Browns here, I really just don't know what to do with Deshaun Watson at this point. A few years ago, you had a dude that was like a locked in top 5 real life quarterback, a top 5 fantasy option. Then he has the suspension, he sits out the year. And with the Browns, he has just not looked good. Maybe he finds some of his former form, this season, but week 1, definitely not someone I want to throw into my lineup, especially going up against this Cowboys defense. Moving over to the Commanders Buccaneers matchup, I talked about Caleb Williams as a rookie, how I'm trusting him as a start. I'm going to do the same thing here with the Commanders. Bucks are typically very tough against the run, but I don't think they're going to be a super tough team for opposing wide receivers, opposing quarterbacks. They've made, I think, probably some negative moves in terms of the plus minus of the moves they've made with their secondary. So I think Jane Daniels will be fine. I think the rushing is going to translate instantly. So even if he's not perfect as a passer, I think the rushing upside can carry him. And we've seen from, a guy like Justin Fields, Anthony Richardson last year, you don't need to be pristine as a passer to be giving you, solid fantasy production. So I have Jane Daniels as a start. Baker Mayfield's going to be a sit. Baker kind of seems like some of those other dudes I've talked about, where maybe you throw him in bye week injury, but week 1, definitely not someone I want to be playing, even though it's a decent matchup here against that Commanders defense. I believe this is the Sunday night game where we have the Rams taking on the Lions. And I think both these guys are kind of like the definition of fringe quarterback plays. I'd say if this was the Lions defense of last year, I'd probably have Matthew Stafford as a start, but I do think the Lions did a decent job kind of addressing their secondary, which was definitely a weakness last year. So Stafford's a fringe play. I think he has a lot of, nice weapons. Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, obviously not going to give you a ton on the ground, but like a fine high to mid-tier QB2. And then kind of a similar thing with Jared Goff. I know people kind of like Jared Goff, Tua. It's like those top options when you're getting into the later round quarterbacks. I prefer the guys like Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, even Matthew Stafford, but I still think Jared Goff belongs, as a fringe play. Solid weapons, going to be giving you solid passing production. And then the final game of the week, Monday Night Football, we have the Jets taking on the 49ers. Hopefully we get to see Aaron Rodgers for a full game. We did not last year. And I think he definitely is someone who could be fantasy relevant. But week 1, really first time we're seeing him with the Jets over a full game, coming off the torn Achilles, and he draws a really tough matchup here against the 49ers. If you drafted Rodgers to be your, top quarterback, you probably have a second option on your bench. I would prefer not to play Aaron Rodgers in this matchup. And then for the 49ers, not a great matchup for Purdy, but I just think with the weapons he has, he's always at worst going to be a fringe option, throwing to Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey. So that's going to wrap it up for all 16 games at the quarterback position. If you have any fantasy questions, you can drop them down below. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.